So I'd like to welcome you all to this study of Tongsa Gyalme Khyentse Rinpoche's work, Living is Dying. And in conjunction with this study of Rinpoche's work, we're also going to be essentially drawing on some resources that we have in the Sangha. And this includes a number of persons from the Sangha and also some guest speakers. So all in all, we have here a program which I think will be a very rich program. This is the first installment today, and it's going to be running until November 27. So I'm somewhat awed to be the person who's supposed to sort of introduce this. There's been a lot of work that's gone into preparing this. So I'd just like to say I've been very impressed and deeply sort of appreciative of all the efforts that's gone into the preparation of this program. I'd like to begin with acknowledging the traditional owners throughout Australia and wherever you might be, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, the present study is going to be one that deals with, you could say it's somewhat a program that's emerging from the very immediate need that despite the presence of the teaching of impermanence in the Buddhist teaching, it's absolutely remarkable how we are capable of ignoring the fact that we're going to die. And I think somehow this present program that reflects that at least some of the people have actually realized that we're coming to an end. We're sort of in the departure lounge. And we are presently, looking at moving to another place. And this is something which in our culture is not ordinarily spoken about. And that's where you can say the brilliance of the Buddhist teaching is that this is completely above board. This is absolutely something that is understandable. And it's something that is not a mystery that we kind of would like to sweep under the carpet and that we don't really talk about. So this is a work which in a Buddhist context, this is a thought which in a Buddhist context is absolutely legitimate and highly workable. So it's not really that to ponder death is something that's bad news, that we need be morose if we're thinking about death. On the other hand, we shouldn't be naive. And I think as much as many of us have heard teachings on Buddhism over the years, and ostensibly we have received instructions on how to handle death, I think all of us are rather awed in what this actually implies. So it's not as if, oh yeah, I'm going to die, but as a Buddhist practitioner, that's cool. I'll be just fine. I think most Buddhists, and I remember reading actually one of the early Dzogchen Rinpoches who said, you know, there's not anybody who really wants to leave this place, even great sages. But that said, you do have remarkable individuals who in no way were afraid of dying. And you know, in the Christian tradition, we have the famous story of Saint Francis, who passed away singing. In the Buddhist traditions, we have stories about great masters who just walked off into space. We have extraordinary stories about individuals who left their body, like the great Mahasiddha Melong Dorje. Apparently there was a ball of light the size of a teacup that he sort of exited through the top of his head and so on. So of course there's a lot of that. And but at the same time, all of us will undoubtedly be somewhat awed in this situation. And certainly I can speak for myself that the thought of death makes me realize that the time that I have right now is extraordinarily precious. But what is particular about the Buddhist teaching is that there is a clarity about what happens with death, and there's a clarity about what we can do. So it's not a situation where we just surrender and say, well, this is something we'd rather not think about. It's just like in fact, it's just like when we give our children education. It's not like, life dies after 8, it's not like life is over after 18. Life begins after 18, and there's a lot you can do to prepare for it. And in that sense, we give our children education. We prepare for what comes next, and that's the responsible thing. And those that are able to, you could say, meet those what we can call those offers, those who take advantage of educational systems and all of that, are able to make greater choices later on in life. And that's the implication also with the Buddhist teaching on dying, that we can prepare ourselves for what comes next. And there's every reason why we should take heart in our present situation as a time where we can prepare for what comes next. Anyway, our teacher, Tsongsan Gyalme Khyentse Rinpoche, very compassionately, he has gathered some of the teachings he's given on the situation on dying. And this is then the work that we're presently looking at. Living is Dying. Rinpoche, and probably as you saw on the website, he says, shouldn't we all try to contemplate the inevitability of our own death at least once this lifetime, particularly as every one of us will die, itself a crucially important piece of information. Doesn't putting some effort into processing the inescapable fact of our own death make sense? So nothing could be truer, but again, if you're like me, it's remarkable how we kind of tend to just forget this. Some of you, and this is where we're presently looking at a great team, and we have actually a team with people who work with the people who are passing on, and we have first of all, I think we all know that this is very much the brainchild, the program as such, us getting together and studying this. This is very much thanks to Tsering Chudran. So of course, Tsering, she's sort of saying, please don't mention me or anything. But of course, we have to. I mean, this is very much thanks to Tsering that we're doing this. And she's assembled a remarkable team. Chanchup Haubner, who for years has actually been the go-to person in the Sangha with regards to the situation on passing on. Equally also Ani Zangmo. And all of these are actually the team that have worked on preparing this present program. We have Kirsten Isbell, who for many years has been working with people who are passing as a nurse. We have Julie St. Auburn, who's been working with Buddhist funerals. And we have Uma Norbu, who's really been helping a lot with gathering together all the sort of technical aspects of this particular course. So we're very indebted to all of this team here. We're also going to have the guest speaker, Kirsten's husband, Ben Isbell, is going to come in and also speak on, as far as I remember, teaching mindfulness at later stages in life. Anyway, we're going to be looking essentially at Rinpoche's book, and so I'm going to be bringing that up on the screen. And we're going to be reading Rinpoche's book, and then also I'm going to be, I guess you could say, leading a contemplation on death at the end of the session, drawing on some of the classical works. Really, the way that we contemplate in the Buddhist teaching is a little bit different from what we could call meditation. Meditation is essential in the Buddhist teaching, really, in order to give our mind space and you could say, the flexibility to work with our particular habitual patterns and to sort of extract ourselves from our general self-absorption and gain a wider perspective. So that's where we meditate. But a lot of the teachings in the Buddhist tradition, they can also be accessed, or rather they are integrated, assimilated through us actually contemplating, thinking about something. And this, in this present work that we have from Rinpoche, on one hand, it's a work that is very practical, but it also contains a lot of contemplations. And contemplation as such is a bit different from meditating, because we're actually thinking. We're actually being active in thinking, but it's the kind of thought where it's not just that we're you could say reading and taking in information. It's already a place where we have complete trust in those from whom the statements come, and as such, we recognize that we have a hard time allowing, you could say, information that goes against the way that we ordinarily think. We have a hard time actually integrating that and giving that the proper attention. And that's where we need to practice contemplation, thinking about things in a deeper way. And that's very often where we'll just read something and then just sit quietly before we get too distracted and let this sink in. And then again, we read some more. And while this is still fresh in the mind, we ponder this. So we'll be doing this as a, you could say, as a part of the course here in contemplation. But I will begin with reading then from Rinpoche's book. And he begins with quoting Murakami, who says, "Death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it." And so this is, again, where we need to have a wider perspective in regards to our situation as living persons. It's not just that we're right now in a difficult situation that because we're going to die. Death will be the beginning of something else. So it's a continual situation of birth and death. And like the title of Rinpoche's work implies, the mere fact that we're born means that we're dying. The mere fact that we've just gotten something new is that it's already aging. And so that understanding of the way that the dependent nature of this concept of death, it stands in opposition to life. As such, it's a dependent arising. Death exists on the very premise of life, and life exists on the very premise of death. So Rinpoche writes then, the instructions given to Buddhists during the process of dying, at the moment of death and after death, are the same whether a person dies peacefully in their sleep at a ripe old age, or unexpectedly, because the causes and conditions that lead to sudden death have matured. Now, already here we're presented with some valuable perspective, which is that it's not necessarily given that we will be able to just die peacefully. We sort of have a romanticized idea that we're all going to die surrounded by friends and it's all going to be very serene. But it could very well be that we die in a car accident, we die in all sorts of unwanted and unexpected ways. So regardless of what happens, all of this is something that we actually regard almost like it shouldn't happen. It's regrettable. It's a bit like we're all being robbed of something. And so the situation of us essentially leaving will be the same regardless of the manner with which we leave, with which we pass on. So Rinpoche writes, the information about dying, death, and beyond that appears in this book is a very simple presentation of one specific and ancient tradition of Buddhist teachings. Although many other authentic Buddhist traditions offer essentially the same advice, as each has developed its own terminology and language, some details may appear to be different. Please don't interpret these variations as contradictions. So, of course, this is presented within the Buddhist tradition of Tibet. And the Buddhist tradition of Tibet has an incredibly accurate science around what happens when we die. You could say in our culture, as much as there might be an acceptance of death to some extent, what happens next is essentially rather speculative. And very often, you could say we use language, which of course is well intended, but doesn't really have much weight. Where we say when somebody passes on, well, now they have gone to their maker, or now this person has found peace. And there's sort of a convention that we like to leave it vague, and we'd like to just think that has happened. But in the Buddhist tradition, and we would recognize that what the Buddhist tradition really has is a knowledge of that which modern science doesn't have. In modern science, we talk about the hard problem of consciousness. Consciousness is not really understood. We have a remarkable science around what is physical, material, and a remarkably absent understanding of what really happens when we die, what really consciousness is. But in the Buddhist tradition, we might not have very advanced material technology, but there certainly is a tremendously sophisticated science around consciousness and what happens with consciousness, how consciousness creates our reality, and what happens as such with us during our lifetime and also when we pass on. So the Tibetan tradition, you could say, it offers an incredible array of insight into this. More or less, of course, all the various traditions have different pieces of advice. They sort of more or less all agree. But then again, you have quite specific teachings on what to do yourself and also how to help others in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions. But it's important that we have that kind of magnanimity where we understand really all the different traditions, they more or less agree. And this even applies also when it comes to the theistic traditions, because also there, as long as there actually is some understanding of consciousness as just not being, you could say, a set of neurons, and once you're dead, and you only live once, and all that kind of stuff, you know, which is sort of, you could say, the natural consequence of a uniquely materialistic science. If you have the religions, then as much as you could say from a Buddhist point of view, the propositions of some of these religions are not very well argued for or consolidated, not easily verifiable, they certainly present a perspective about something beyond. And that in itself is remarkable and very valuable. And that's, from that point of view, as a Buddhist, whether we go to a Christian funeral or a ritual of another religion with regards to passing people who have passed, it's so important that we just have a deep respect for whatever that might be. We are literally helping the deceased by just being positive and present with these various teachings. So within the Buddhist traditions and also beyond the Buddhist traditions, all these various insights are very, very helpful, and we should really respect all of these different approaches. But then again, in the traditions that we're looking at here, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we talk about death in terms of just being another passage, another bardo, an intermediate state from one place to the next. Rinpoche then says, these teachings about death and the bardos have been passed down through a long lineage of brilliant Buddhist thinkers, each of whom went to great lengths in order to examine the process in minute detail and from every angle. So of course, this is Rinpoche being very accommodating to the Western way of you could say, respecting great people with great insight, where we think of people with great insight as thinkers. Actually, in the Buddhist tradition, we generally say thinking is not that helpful. But in the Western context, yes, we do think of people who are wise. We think of them perhaps as great thinkers. Because in the Buddhist tradition, we talk more about sages. But the bottom line is that what we are talking about are individuals who are free of confusion. And on the basis of that, have, you could say, a tremendous capacity to understand what happens with consciousness, particularly then in this case, what happens with consciousness when someone passes on. And so Rinpoche says their advice may be especially useful for Buddhists or those attracted to the Buddhist teachings, but it is equally relevant for anyone who will eventually die. So even if you're not a Buddhist, if you are open-minded, curious, or contemplating your own death or that of a loved one, you may well find something in these pages that will help. So here again, it applies. This is this situation with dying and the various traditions that have an insight into that which is intangible, namely consciousness, in their various ways. All of these will have they will agree in many different ways. And so that's where, if we look, regardless of where we're coming from, if we look at the Buddhist teaching that we're going to find here, it will inevitably agree with most traditions that have insight into what happens when we die. And also it will be something that we can apply regardless of who we are. Rinpoche says everything that happens to us in life and death depends entirely on the causes and conditions that we have accumulated. And this is something we can verify. Of course, this is what we call karma, but it's not something that has any mystical, in no way mystical. It's simply just that we can see from apple seeds, you have apple trees. So cause precedes a particular result. But then again, we also understand that it's not just a one-shot deal in which you do something and then this results. It's obviously complex. You sow an apple seed, then it depends on the water, it depends on the circumstances, the light, what have you, precipitation, all of that. So that's where a cause definitely, you could say, is pregnant with the result. But then again, how it unfolds depends on all the, you could say, secondary causes, or what we call conditions. So that's where we understand that everything we look at in the phenomenal world, including our own mind, operates like that. We are the sum of what we do in terms of how we say, how we conduct ourselves physically, verbally, psychologically, and also the way that we work with our attitudes and the way that we work with our perceptions and so forth. So that shapes us. So that is where what happens to us in life is on the basis of exactly what we're doing with ourselves. So that also applies to the situation of death. What will come after death will be exactly the same situation. It will be dependent on what we have, how we have constructed ourselves. Each person will therefore experience physical death and the dissolution of the body's element quite differently. Each of our journeys through the bardo will also be unique. So any and all descriptions of dying, death, and the bardos can only ever be generalizations. Nevertheless, when the process of dying begins, having even a rough idea about what is happening not only goes a long way toward allaying our worst fears, but it will also help us face death calmly and with equanimity. So it's important that we don't get too sort of hung up on, for example, sometimes we say 49 days, and then someone will take rebirth. These are all rough estimates. And of course, it's very much based on the individual, and it has so much to do with their psychology and also their physical conditions. So for example, those of us who observe death, we will see that in fact, the dissolution that we talk about in the Buddhist teaching in terms of earth dissolving into water, water dissolving into fire, and so on, this we can actually observe, but they will of course happen in various ways. Anyway, it's very helpful for us then to have a science and a body of knowledge that gives us some idea, and this will enable us to have some sense of what's going to happen to us and what's happening with those with whom those we spend time with as they're passing away. To those of you who take notice of such details, I should say a word about the inconsistent use of Sanskrit spelling and diacritics in this book. Usually when Sanskrit appears in Roman characters instead of Devanagari script, diacritics are used to help the reader pronounce words correctly. These days, as the study of Sanskrit is relatively rare, fewer and fewer of us are able to read diacritics, and for some, the mere sight of all those squiggles and dots adds yet another level of confusion. Diacritics have therefore not been applied to the Sanskrit terms that appear in the main body of the text or to the names of deities, bodhisattvas, etc. But some have been retained in quoted texts. Similarly, when quoted texts have included Tibetan-style spellings of Sanskrit, for example, hung instead of hum, these spellings have been retained. Ironically, although these days, this is Rinpoche speaking, I am always so busy, at heart I am unusually lazy. Trying to juggle these two extremes is quite a challenge, which is why I ended up writing much of this book on a social networking app. If my English is at least readable, it is thanks to Janine Schultz, Sarah, Casey Wilkinson, Chime Meto, Pema Maya, and Sarah A. Wilkinson. The framework of this book was created in response to a list of nearly 100 very good questions about death that were gathered by various friends of mine. I would particularly like to thank my Chinese friends, Jennifer Key, Jane W., Dolly VT, Philip Philippou, and the spiritual care team at Sukhavati in Bad Sorrow, Germany. Chris Whiteside and the spiritual care team at Sochenbera, Miriam Pokora from the Bodhicharya Hospice in Berlin, and all those who attended the teaching at Schloss Langenburg. I would also like to thank Ujin Topyal Rinpoche, Pema Chodron, Khenpo Sonam Tashi, Khenpo Sonam Punso, Tantong Tugu, and Jan Devosin for contributing their expertise, Adam Piercy, Eric Pema Kunzang, John Canty, and Lara Mermelstein for generously sharing their translations, Jane W., Chu Suchin, and Vera Ho, Florence Ko, Chris Yao, Paravi Wongchi Rache, Albert, Seiko Sakuragi, Rui Faro Saraiva for their help and advice, Cecile Hohenlohe and her family, Versing, and everyone at Varna for their kind and generous hospitality, Andreas Schultz for designing and typesetting Living is Dying, and the artists Arjun Kaiker and Tara Di Jesu for contributing their beautiful pictures. So this was then the preface of the book. So, chapter 1. Will I die? For the first 3 decades of his life, Prince Siddhartha lived an idyllic existence behind the walls of his father's vast palace. Universally loved and admired, the handsome prince married a beautiful princess, they had a son, and everyone was happy. But in all that time, the prince never once stepped outside the palace gates. Now, there's a bit of a story that goes with this. This is, of course, because at the time when the Buddha was born, there was a prophecy that he could very well become a great renunciant. And as such, then his father really tried his very best to prevent Prince Siddhartha from having too much contact with the real world. And as such, then the prince grew up surrounded by tremendous luxury and a very protected, you could say, hedonistic lifestyle that sort of prevented him from thinking deeper about things. Nevertheless, and then Rinpoche writes, in his 30th year, Siddhartha asked his faithful charioteer Channa to drive him through his father's great city, and for the first time ever, the prince saw a dead body. It was a terrible shock. Will what happened to that man happen to me? He asked Channa. Will I die too? Yes, Your Majesty, replied Channa. Everyone dies, even princes. Turn the chariot around, Channa, ordered the prince. Take me home. Back at the palace, Prince Siddhartha thought about what he had just seen. What was the point of being king if not only his family, but everyone on this earth had to live under the terrible shadow of the fear of death? There and then, the prince decided that for everyone's sake, he would devote his life to discovering how all human beings can go beyond both birth and death. This very famous story contains a great many teachings. Just the fact that Prince Siddhartha asked, will I die, is not only touchingly innocent, but also remarkably brave. Will I die? Must mighty Siddhartha, the future king of the Shakyas, whose destiny is to be ruler of the universe, die? How many of us, from royalty to ordinary people like you and me, would even think about asking such a question? So we have here then this illustration where actually the more sort of elaborate story speaks about how the prince then was witness to someone who was old, decrepit, and the prince then living a lifestyle in which he was surrounded by beautiful people and not really exposed to anything like he encountered here. Encountering old age was a novel, was something that shocked him. Also then, we say on a second journey, then the prince came across someone who was ill, who was sick, dying. And then finally, then he came across someone who already was dead then. And so this is where, like Rinpoche says, what emerged out of that could sound very naive in the sense of, or innocent in the sense that the Prince Siddhartha was then determined to get to the bottom of this. What is it really that drives this condition in which we suffer as a consequence of these continually changing conditions that we find ourselves in? And while we could say this is innocent and so forth, it really highlights, or rather it's significant, because this is where really the Buddha's journey to enlightenment began. And it came from an extraordinary, and this is where Rinpoche refers to this as being incredibly brave, this resolve to actually wishing to get to the bottom of it. We can't really say that the Buddha was foolhardy, because already in his life, he had demonstrated incredible accomplishment in the sports, but also academically. And so the prince was not, as much as he had been shielded from a lot of realities, he was not naive, and he was not stupid. He was somebody who then had, and of course, in the Buddhist tradition, we talk about also this stems from many lifetimes of being a bodhisattva. He possessed this incredible resolve to then wishing to get to the bottom of really what is the nature of reality, and how could we go beyond this suffering associated with these changing circumstances. So what we want to take with us when we look at the Buddha's leaving the palace is very much this courage and this resolve. And this is also reflected in the, you could say, incredible application that followed in the next few years. The Buddha then studying in the spiritual traditions of India, and then finally actually abandoning all systems and really exposing himself to truth completely, uncompromisingly, where the Buddha then broke through confusion and attained perfect enlightenment. So this is a story of someone who, in every sense of the word, changed history, and in every sense of the word, penetrated through to the core of the nature of reality. So that's where, of course, like Rinpoche says, how many of us, from royalty to ordinary people like you and me, would even think about asking such a question? The question was brave, but the prince's reaction, "Take me home," sounds on the face of it a little childish. Aren't adults supposed to deal with disconcerting news more maturely? But then how many adults would bother thinking, will I die? And how many would then cut short an interesting outing to examine and contemplate the answer? And of course, this led then to this great resolve of pursuing the project of the ultimate truth and getting to the bottom really of where suffering originates. Rinpoche says, we human beings think we are so clever. Look at all the systems and networks we have set up. Most of us have an address where letters and packages can be sent, and bank accounts where money can be safely kept. A human being invented the wristwatch so the rest of us can keep track of time. And another human being invented the iPhone so that we can keep in touch with our network of friends, acquaintances, business partners, and family. Human beings have also developed systems for making sure that societies run smoothly. The police maintain public order, traffic lights control the flow of road traffic, and governments administer social welfare and defense systems. Yet, even though we human beings have put lifetimes of effort into organizing, designing, and structuring every aspect of our world, how many of us have been curious and courageous enough to ask, will I die? Shouldn't we all try to contemplate the inevitability of our own death at least once this lifetime, particularly as, and this is significant, every single one of us will die, itself a crucially important piece of information. Doesn't putting a little effort into processing this inescapable fact of our own death make sense? So of course, this is, you could say, universally something that has been pondered down through the ages, and many great beings have provided some answers. Some, you could say, rest within particular given structures of logic and systems, and some, like the Buddha, going completely beyond any limitations, conceptual limitations, and penetrating through to a complete understanding of this. But so we have this question universally. But what's particularly also in the modern context is, as Rinpoche highlights, we very often think in terms of what is the responsible way for managing our life, and what is the intelligent way of securing what we want. And that's where this is associated, particularly then in the modern context, with systems, practical systems, like the systems of communication, public order, and all these kind of things. Here, we are looking into the greatest of all sciences, which is about consciousness and what exactly happens with it. Rinpoche says, once we're dead, what will happen to all our addresses, homes, businesses, and holiday retreats? What will happen to our wristwatches, iPhone, and all those traffic lights? To our insurance and pension plans? To that roll of dental floss you bought this morning? Buddhists believe that of all the beings on this planet, human beings are the most likely to ask, will I die? Can you imagine a parrot thinking, should I eat my nuts and seeds right now, just in case I die tonight? Or can I risk saving them until tomorrow? Animals just don't think like that. And they certainly don't think about causes and conditions. So of course, this is not about in any way denigrating animals, which we very often highlight, how they are sensitive, caring, and extraordinary beings. But we would generally define the higher realms of samsara as the place where we actually think in terms of cause and effect, that we actually do acknowledge that what happens to us next happens on the basis of the actions that came prior. And so that's where some of the lower realms and the animal realms and so on, they fail in that regard. Then again, even though you have some of the realms where there actually is an understanding of cause and effect, there might be just too much comfort. And this we also have in the modern situation where we're so, you say, concerned with comfort, that very often the pursuit of comfort becomes a distraction in itself. So that's a little bit like the human realm becoming the God realm. Rinpoche says, in fact, according to the Buddha Dharma, not even the gods and celestial beings ever think of asking, will I die? The gods are far more interested in their meticulously clean, fine porcelain saucers and silver spoons, their exquisitely brewed tea, and their entrancing music. The gods are said to love gazing at vast cloud formations, magically creating swimming pools or fountains in the midst of the largest and the fluffiest, then spending hours, sometimes days, contemplating their beauty. This kind of activity dominates the lives of the gods and is far more interesting to them than asking, will I die? I doubt such a thought would enter their heads. So again, this is where the conditions of comfort become really an obstacle in terms of just distracting us. Human beings, on the other hand, have the capacity to wander, yet the inexorability of our own death rarely occurs to us. When do any of us think about death? While we are experiencing terrible suffering? No. In the midst of ecstatic happiness? Again, no. We are intelligent and aware, and therefore enjoy the conditions that support the formulation of such a question. Yet we put all our time and energy into shoring up the self-deception that we will never die. We numb ourselves from the pain of unavoidable realities by keeping our minds busy and entertained, and by making elaborate plans for the future. In a way, this is precisely what makes being human so wonderful. But the catch is that by doing so, we create a false sense of security. We forget that both our own death and the death of all those we know and love are inescapable. And this is it, we forget. So it's not that we're not intelligent. It's not that we actually might ask these existential questions about what does it all mean? What will happen to me when I die? We might ask them. And again, it's probably not when we are experiencing great suffering. Also, it's not something that we'll do when we're distracted by ecstatic happiness, but it might come through us. And in some way, you could say the human condition is blessed with an equal portion of suffering and also the freedom to actually reflect and be proactive in our decision making about the future and understanding our situation. But what really what happens with the human, and particularly then in the present day age, is that there's so much entertainment, there's so much busyness about what really has no real, you could say, purpose, meaning, consequence. And so yes, it's perhaps entertaining, wonderful, and so on, but the thing is, it veils and it sort of sweeps under the carpet this fact that we are all dying. We would say there's two things that are certain about, or rather there's, with regards to death, there's one thing that is completely certain and one thing that's completely uncertain. And the certain thing is we will die. The uncertain thing is when. So this is something that signifies death in a way, and this is something that we, again, we suppress or we conveniently forget. Anyway, here we are attempting to ponder this. So Rinpoche says here at the end, think about it. By the time each one of us has been alive for a quarter of a century, we will have lost at least one close friend or family member. One day you're having dinner with your parents. The next day, then the next day, they're dead and you never see them again. This kind of experience forces us to face up to the truth of death. And for some, it is a very bitter and terrifying truth. So again, this is terrifying and bitter, you could say a bitter and terrifying truth for those who are unprepared. And it is like so many things in life, you know, if we don't pay taxes on time, if we don't prepare for all sorts of inevitable situations, if we don't buy loo paper or whatever it might be, then we face the consequences. So there's always a sense that we need to actually take into account what's going to come. And that's where, particularly here then, in this culture where we're very ignorant around consciousness and there's not really an understanding of death and what comes next, that's where it's very helpful that we then have this privileged situation of the Buddhist teaching, where in fact there is a proper understanding of exactly what to do. The Buddhists are very practical. It's not just that they give, you could say, the final word on what is death, you know. They of course do that, but at the same time, that's really just what we could say a philosophical position, some sort of like understanding of things. And that we could say, well, doesn't that provide some sense of safety? Isn't that what the teaching is supposed to do? Not really. You know, it's just because we have a map doesn't mean that the journey is undertaken. And so it's very helpful to have a map. It's very helpful to have an idea of where this is going. But actually, we need to be able to undertake the journey. We need to be actually able to drive. We need to be able to navigate. And we need to actually do this, not just think about it. And that's again where the annoying thing about the Buddhist teaching is that we actually have to do something. We can't just subscribe to the church or have all the Buddhist paraphernalia, do all the Buddhist things, but it actually has to be a place where we're deeply touched. And that's where the reflection on death is so essential. We would say that the reflection on impermanence in death is possibly the most significant motivation on the Buddhist path. It's not about knowing about enlightenment and nirvana. It's about, first of all, relating to the reality of where we are now and the the volatility of it, that it doesn't last, that we are here for a very short time. And what we want to undertake, which is gain mastery of our own mind, so that when we face death, there's a confidence. This requires that we actually uproot our superficial preoccupation with things that actually have no real value. And so in the Buddhist teaching, there is the reflection on impermanence as one of the most significant reflections. We say among all the footprints in the forest, that of the elephant is the far greatest. And so of all the reflections, we say that of impermanence is the greatest. So I just want to, and of course, many of you are familiar with this, but this is then where we have something to contemplate. I'm taking something from a text from Jamgun Kongtrul. It's a commentary on the treasure teaching of Chögyal Dzogchen Lingpa, and it's known as the Light of Wisdom. And in here, there is exactly this kind of reflection that we need to undertake. So reflection is not just, or contemplation, not just that we sit down and ponder along our own lines, which usually are not that brilliant. There's every reason, if we were going to have a map, and if we're going to sort of, you could say, take counsel in how to travel in places, it's usually helpful to have the advice from somebody who's actually been there, who knows the place and who knows what the conditions are. And that's where we then don't sit down and sort of just think about things as sort of, you know, in the spirit of, I'd like to be a free thinker and make up my own opinion. We have great sages that we can rely on, like Rinpoche said, great thinkers. So here then, Jamgun Kongtrul writes, in general, all that appears as world and beings are composite phenomena produced through the interdependence of causes meeting with conditions, and therefore not a single one is permanent. A sutra says, monks, all composite things are impermanent. How are they impermanent? This is described in the Udana Varga. The end of gathering is depletion. The end of rising is falling. The end of meeting is parting. The end of living is death. These are words that we contemplate, and we don't resent it. We can't, as much as it's inconvenient and wish it didn't happen, that we would have to part from those that are dear, that what we have created will come undone, that what we've gathered is going to be scattered and so forth. We can't really resent that. It's just a fact that we need to live with. But then again, we look at the great sages who've become comfortable with this. And as such, for them, it's the process of life merging into death, merging into another life and so forth, is a journey forward and is done in the service of sentient beings. So it's not something that we are worried about in that sense. But then again, for us to become sages, we need to actually cultivate wisdom. And that's where we initially need to have the motivation to persevere on that. And that is where we contemplate then on the fact that these superficial constructs that we very often have as our reference point, they won't last. Jamgun Kongtrul writes, not beyond these four limits of impermanence, gross impermanence, is the changes. Not beyond these four limits of impermanence, gross impermanence, is the changes of the world and beings, creation and destruction, years and months and the four seasons. Subtle impermanence is the moment to moment, aging and changing, just like the instantaneous movement of the rising and setting of the sun and moon. In particular, the human lifespan is indefinite, so the time of death lies uncertain. There are many causes for death, making it sure that we will die. A human life is similar to a flash of lightning in the sky, fading away the moment it has appeared. Actually, if you talk with Tibetan doctors, they will always say there are far more reasons to die than reasons to stay alive. The conditions for dying are far more numerous. The Vinaya scripture describes this, like the mountain river flowing into the ocean, like the sun or moon approaching the western mountain, like day and night, hours and minutes quickly go by. the lives of people pass in this same way. I remember one of my teachers, Pema Wangel Rinpoche, he would say, when he began contemplating impermanence, and then he would, at night, he would look at how the shadows grew long. And again, it would really touch him deeply, how life goes quickly. So Jamgon Kongtrul writes, when you die, nothing besides the sacred Dharma, such as high mental capacity, friends, servants, or wealth, will be of any help whatsoever. Casting away mundane and superficial aims as though they were spittle, engage in the correct practice of the sacred Dharma, as it has been taught by the victorious ones and their sons. So this is where we need to look to those who actually have an insight into the nature of reality. And having gained insight into the nature of reality, having gained insight into the pure nectar-like truth of realization, of enlightenment. And that's where it's not just about understanding the bitter facts of reality, but it's understanding the brilliant, enlightened qualities of enlightenment, endowed with all the qualities of compassion and strength, wisdom, and so on. And that is what will help us then when we face death. But engaging in that science is not about us, well, we call it Buddhism, but really what we mean with that is really just the science of reality that unveils the brilliant qualities of awakening. And so that's where we could look to those that have successfully escaped confusion and the cycle of what we call samsara, birth and death, and achieve that which is the unconditional insight into the qualities of perfect awakening. And this is something that's, you could say, is very heartening. When we have great sages talking about impermanence, they're not doing so to become, you could say, to spoil the party or to be pessimistic, but more to say there is something that needs to be done. There's a very important project that needs to be undertaken. But all of that really is premised on us reflecting again and again on impermanence. There was, the other day we were studying the Treasury of Precious Qualities, and there's a particularly, I find these few lines very poignant and helpful. Jigme Lingpa writes, a powerful bowman's shaft is swift indeed, but not as swift as pretas moving on the earth. The pretas in the air are swifter still, and swifter yet the gods of sun and moon. But swiftest of them all is human life. The prime of youth is ravaged and brought low by age. Disease disturbs health's equilibrium, and perfect situations are all ruined by decay. So soon does death lay siege to life. So if we take the fleeting appearances of this life as our reference point and that we hold on to, if we hold on to those that we love, if we hold on to our body and our life as such, if we hold on to that, yes, we'll be not only will we be bitterly disappointed, but we'll also fail to really uncover the true potential of who we are, and we'll also be unable to serve others. So if we truly do care for others, then the reflection on impermanence that brings us to practice the path is extremely valuable. So we should have no kind of sentimentality around the impermanence of our present situations, and just be willing to face that, yes, everything that is dear to us will dissolve, will be lost. But once we can swallow that, when we can accommodate that, then everything lies open. Then we are extracting ourselves from our naive perspectives and entering into a much greater vision. Again, the last contemplation here, this is from Paltru Rinpoche, from Words of Our Perfect Teacher. Many of you will be familiar with this. He writes, meditation on impermanence is therefore the prelude that opens the way to all practices of Dharma. When he was asked for instruction on how to dispel adverse circumstances, Geshe Potawa answered with the following words. Think about death and impermanence for a long time. Once you're certain that you're going to die, you will no longer find it hard to put aside harmful actions, nor difficult to do what is right. After that, meditate for a long time on love and compassion. Once love fills your heart, you will no longer find it hard to act for the benefit of others. Then meditate for a long time on emptiness, the natural state of all phenomena. Once you fully understand emptiness, you will no longer find it hard to dispel all your delusions. So this is what the Buddha's teaching is about. This is what we mean when we talk about escaping the cycle of birth and death. But it is premised on, as we see here, initially, you could say, relinquishing our naive assumptions about permanence and our naive assumptions about life and contemplating death and impermanence. That's the first contemplation. Paul Rinpoche writes, once we have such conviction about impermanence, all the ordinary activities of this life come to seem as profoundly abhorrent as a greasy meal does to someone suffering from nausea. My revered master often used to say, this is referring to Nyushul Lungtok, whatever I see of high rank, power, wealth, and beauty in this world arouses no desire in me. That is, it's not true, this is not Nyushul Lungtok speaking, this is Jigme Jiawen Yuwa. Anyway, he said, whatever I see of high rank, power, wealth, or beauty in this world arouses no desire in me. That is because seeing how noble beings of old spent their lives, I have just a little understanding of impermanence. I have no deeper instruction than this to offer you. So, just how deeply have you become permeated with this thought of impermanence? You should be like Geshe Karak Gomchong, who went to meditate in the mountain solitudes of Jomo Karak in the province of Tsang. In front of his cave, there was a thorn bush, which kept catching on his clothes. At first he thought, maybe I should cut it down. But then he said to himself, but after all, I may die inside of this cave. I really cannot say whether I shall even come out again alive. Obviously, it is more important for me to get on with my practice. When he came back out, he had the same problem with the thorns. This time he thought, I'm not at all sure that I shall ever go back inside. And so it went for many years until he was an accomplished master. When he left, the bush was still uncut. Rigsen Jigme Lingpa would always spend the time of the constellation Rishi in autumn at a certain hot spring. The sides of the pool had no steps, making it very difficult for him to climb down to the water and sit in it. His followers offered to cut some steps, but he replied, why take so much trouble when we don't know if we will be around next year? He would always be speaking of impermanence like that, my master told me. We too, as long as we have not fully assimilated such an attitude, should meditate on it. Start by generating bodhicitta, and as the main practice, train your mind by all these various means until impermanence really permeates your every thought. Finally, conclude by sealing the practice with dedication of merit. Practicing in this way, strive to the best of your ability to emulate the great beings of the past. And Paul Rinpoche then concludes writing, impermanence is everywhere, yet I still think things will last. I have reached the gates of old age, yet I still pretend I'm young. Bless me and misguided beings like me, that we may truly understand impermanence. So at this point, we're actually, time is actually up. This is the first session. I'm not I know Tsering was saying this should be interactive. So of course, I'm a little bit guilty if I should have left time aside to question and answers. But anyway, if you don't mind, we maybe go a few minutes over time in case anybody has some questions. You're very welcome to ask any questions, but also, you know, in some way it's implicit in what we're looking here, that it's not like there's a lot of bones in this. What really is the challenge is, and this is actually the answer, actually comes in this question that just pops up. What is the resistance from hearing death? Well, that's exactly it. There's nothing about death that we can't understand, really. But actually, what is remarkable is our capacity to forget it or not take into contemplation and so forth. So it's more about, like Paul Trimbridge, he says, you know, what is it he says? He says, those like me, right? He says, bless me and misguided beings like me, that we may truly understand impermanence. And that's where he says, impermanence is everywhere, yet I still think things will last. Well, that's it. We are remarkable in that we actually think things will last. So that's where you could say the question that just came in there is kind of the question. Why are we so reluctant to contemplate, recognize, understand this? Yeah. So so we could actually, that could be our homework until next time. Why are we so reluctant to understand the imminence of death? Okay. So fear of death is making people stubborn. Not really. We could construe it that way, that it's a sort of that we are stubbornly suppressing the fact of death. But I'm not entirely sure. And certainly if you're in this workshop here, you're probably pretty open to the idea. What is sort of more seems to be the issue is more a habitual way of looking at things. And that's where the contemplating impermanence is so important, because contemplation is supposed to yank us out of habitual ways of seeing things. And someone says, when we contemplate on impermanence, how to avoid becoming more attached to our beloved ones, since we only have limited time left? That's a very good one. And actually, I was just going over something earlier. This is where Padampa Sangha says, you know, time is running out, people of Tingri. Don't bicker and argue. That's actually this is what really, as we contemplate impermanence, we should understand what a waste of precious opportunity it is if we fail to use this time and we use it on bickering. Actually, I have it here. I'm just going to bring it up, and let's just see here. Yeah. Okay. So Padampa Sangha said, families are fleeting as a crowd on a market day. People of Tingri, don't bicker or fight. And it reminded me of something from my teacher, Chakti Tugu, who I found this quote on the web once, and I think it's so good. It says, don't burden others with your expectations. Understanding their limitations can inspire compassion instead of disappointment, ensuring beneficial and workable relationships. Remember that you have only a short time together. Be grateful for every day you share. So this is, you could say, this is one of the great values of contemplating impermanence. I think we hope things will last and fear that they won't. Exactly, yeah. That is our predicament. But that's where we need to actually go beyond this, because one thing is that you could say we can identify our predicament and the shortcomings of our predicament, but that's good, and that's first step one. But then we actually need to be proactive and then moving beyond. We're not stuck with hope and fear. We're not stuck with, you could say, our inability to understand impermanence and death. We need to actually arrive at a place where we do understand it, and it should be something that informs our choices, what we do. Yeah. Until when one is well prepared for death. Thank you. Well, that's where we would say, if we look at the lives of great masters and see how they actually, as a consequence of contemplating death, they actually practiced. What is it Milarepa says? Out of fear of death and impermanence, I ran to the mountains, and it is here that I have found the citadel of deathlessness. So when we really understand this, then we follow in the footsteps of the sages. And at that point, even we don't even need to say sages as extraordinary beings, rather just beings who did what makes perfect sense. So are the vague conventions you mentioned about what happens when we die, going to the Creator, returning home, perhaps the same as believing in rebirth? No, these are more when we don't really have a science around rebirth. Then we begin to sort of just leave it vague. Of course, here it's very different. Here we're not vague. And this is where we begin to understand really what is the nature of consciousness and how consciousness then, its nature is to re-embody itself. Within what we call relative truth, there is this continual re-embodiment that takes place on the basis of cause and effect. So it's a sound idea, but we can't prove it, just like we can't prove that heaven after death exists either, but it can create a wholesome segue for those still living to consolidate their grief. That is not true. And that's where, this is where Buddhism, you could say, stands out, because this is where there is, you could say the sound science around understanding consciousness. So this is where this is very, very important, that we actually arrive at a clear understanding of what consciousness is, so that we know how to apply the path. So initially we need actually to understand the theory of what consciousness is. And this is of course what we do in the studies of the Buddhist theory. But this is never about belief or something like that. It's about, just like we, in natural sciences, we work with what is verifiable, observable, and so forth. We engage similarly also with, you could say, the most empirical aspect of our reality, which is the first person subjectivity, experience, individual experience. Again, this is, you could say, news in certain quarters, but it is certainly something that's been the premise for the entire science of the Buddhist teaching since the time of the Buddha. And so then this also applies for the next, really. How do we know believing in rebirth isn't just another placated way we reconcile the unknown or teaching on rebirth to elicit something else within us? Exactly. And that is pretty much what the modern person would, how the modern person would approach the understanding of rebirth, consciousness, and so forth. And that is where then you say the modern science is sorely lacking. So we, of course, us who are heirs to the Buddhist teaching now, we hope that this will be remedied in the years to come. But presently, we are fortunate if we have trust in this teaching, this methodology. This is then what provides a clear way forward in the face of death. Yeah. Well, this is very good feedback, because this, of course, highlights, you could say, the extraordinary qualities of the study that we are undertaking right now. All right, thank you very much for joining us in this session, and we'll just conclude with dedication, which is incidentally also from Chakdu Rinpoche. This virtuous accumulation of merit we offer so that all obstacles dissolve, and that at the time of our death, each of us may find ease in dying and swift rebirth in the pure land of great bliss, quickly gaining enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So thank you very much. And see you again next week, Sunday, 5:30. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob.
Thank you, Jakob. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Jakob.
you.
Thank you, Jakob.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Sally.